Mr. Speaker, for calling me up here. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, everyone. This is going to be a good round. So, in 2006, the Respect for America's Fallen Heroes Act was presented before Congress. The law would force groups protesting at funerals to stay at least 300 feet from the front gate of the cemetery, and the groups could not begin their protest until 60 minutes before or 60 minutes after the funeral. The bill passed with a 408-3 vote in Congress, and a unanimous vote in the, you said Congress, I'm assuming you meant the House, and a unanimous vote in the Senate. We say that this should not have, we say this should not have passed. This is a bad law. We shouldn't have this. Bad. Cautious.
Bad, okay. So,
Normatively negative.
It's
on balance.
So wait, let me understand. If you're protesting, why would they be protesting? I'm not understanding.
So like there are
the
groups
connection between protest and death.
Like, okay, so if someone is at a funeral and someone thinks that the person did bad things in his life or something,
okay.
and they come to the funeral with signs and things, and they protest at the funeral. Or usually the way this happened was with like the Westboro Baptist Church, where they were protesting, like, it's called the Respect for America's Fallen Heroes Act, because there would be soldiers coming back from war that were deceased, and these people would protest that because they thought that, you know, it was like God's like just retribution and things like that.
Is there like a prerequisite for the dead person that they have to meet in order to like
no, just funerals in general. No funeral. It doesn't have to be like a fallen hero. It just has to be a funeral.
And I just want to get like the specifics. They have to be 300 feet away from the entrance to the cemetery, and they have to be like they can only protest 60 minutes before, and then from that point until 60 minutes after, they're not allowed to protest.
Yes.
Okay. I don't think I have any more questions.
You're all set?
Yep.
All right. To that end, we advance 4 independent arguments for why we think this is a bad law. The first thing that we'd like to talk about are the ways in which this violates the First Amendment. We think this happens in 2 important ways. First, we think it violates the freedom of speech that we have. The second thing that it violates is the idea of the right to protest. And these are both very important ideas enshrined in the First Amendment of the Constitution. So usually when we're looking to restricting some of these rights, we need credible amounts of evidence that we're invoking substantial social damages. Like, there's a lot of like precedent that goes into this through the courts. Like, for example, we have instances like smoking advertisements that we say are banned because on balance these are socially negative. However, there's an even higher burden for this. We're considering that we're limiting even 2 parts of this First Amendment. So we have to be able to show that it actually is outweighed in those ways. And even then, there are forms of expression that we acknowledge in society, that even though they're negative, which we're going to talk about later, we still permit these because in our society we generally defer towards respecting the First Amendment, generally defer towards allowing lots of ideas in speech, because the idea is that by restricting speech that we're forbidding less popular ideas to come to the surface. And just because they're less popular doesn't mean that they are not a substantial part of our civic discourse. And that just because they're not popular doesn't mean that they're not right. So the standard that we have to show is not that they're correct statements, what's being said at this funeral, but that as a society we defer towards respecting these minority rights because on balance it's a good thing. That's why we generally defer towards being true to the First Amendment. So the second thing that we'd like to talk about are instances in which we allow hurtful speech. Like, we allow this sort of thing all the time. Like, hate speech against minorities is, like, allowed if you're just, like, on the street. Like, ad hominem attacks are allowed. Like, for example, we have the KKK. There are neo-Nazis marching in Jewish neighborhoods. Like, these are things that we don't think are good on our side of the house, but we still defer, like, if you cross-apply our analysis from before, we generally defer towards respecting these freedoms of expression, because the point is that the government shouldn't become a censor of the content of speech. Now we have pretty much the extent of the government's ability to regulate this sort of thing are time, place, manner restrictions. Like, the government can reasonably say, we're going to restrict the time and the place or the way in which you're protesting. However, the problem is in this case, by restricting the time and the place and the manner, you're actually censoring the message itself. This is important because the time, place, and manner restriction that we normally apply in these circumstances no longer applies in this case, because an essential part of the message is the time, is the place, and is the manner. So by deferring to the standard, we're actually censoring the speech, and this is what we say bad in the interest of protecting minority viewpoints. So the third thing that we'd like to talk about is that there's no right, in quotes, to have a protestless funeral. So another way that we can weigh freedoms of speech, or any freedoms that we acknowledge in society, is by showing how freedoms like contradict each other and having this sort of weighing analysis between different rights. But the thing is, there's no right that we acknowledge to have a funeral that has a specific quality or exists in a specific way. And I think in this case, what we would rather do is defer towards something like John Stuart Mill's harm principle, that our right to speak in protest is much more pertinent than like the right to be offended by the speech. That we have our rights to be able to do what we want, insofar as it doesn't hurt others. But just because this speech happens to be around an emotional event, it doesn't mean that funerals are exempt by that standard from unpopular speech. Just because there's a uniquely emotional quality about funerals doesn't mean that that's a legitimate justification for censoring that speech. Like for example, there's no example I have written here. I probably would have one, but like there are all sorts of like for example like the 9/11 conspiracy theorists. Like even though they might not be correct, even though there's debate about that, we don't censor their speech just because it's an emotional issue for a great number of people. So the fourth thing that we'd like to talk about is why this law is completely ineffective and impossible to truly enforce. So the only measure that can be passed to keep protesters away is like a physical like boundary for them. So we think that even if they can accomplish this, like literally keeping people away from the premises, which is possible by police force, but this is only going to do is just going to incentivize louder and more spirited protests when they're further away. And because of this law, the protests also become a media spectacle, which is actually exactly what these people want when they're going to protest in the first place, where they get all this media attention, where they get the police barricade with the riot-enforcing shields, like along creating a barrier 60 feet away. This is what they want. It actually allows them to propagate their message even more. So also what this does is you're going to be incentivizing martyrs and sympathizers to increase the power of the causes in these cases. Like you're going to have the Westboro Baptist Church is being kept from protesting, and then people are going to be like, oh, that's a freedom of speech violation. We're going to actually defend these ideas. It's going to take people who would otherwise be neutral in these cases and incentivize them towards actually getting involved in this sort of situation, which we don't think is on balance a good thing. And of course, the other possibility that protesters will find other outlets, like going to the wakes or the homes of these families, or trying to find ways around these laws to be able to protest the deaths of these individuals. So in this case, what we defer to that the best action is inaction. And we need to send societal messages that these protests will be ignored. Because if these protesters think that their actions aren't working, then they will stop, or they'll move on. Whereas you incite a group by using this legislation, by telling them that what they're doing is not working. So you're only going to be encouraging this behavior. Not only that, but it's going to be at the expense of several important rights that we generally defer to in society. We propose.
I think the Prime Minister for his remarks called on the leader of the
You need
opposition.
to get your own timer, Raj.
So the next one, sorry, around not to exceed 8 minutes. Here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to my partner, and thank you to the opposition for bringing up a very good case. So, our whole case is going to hinge around this thing. That they speak about the freedom of rights on their side. They speak about why funerals should not be an exception. But we say, they also speak about how, on their side of the house, what the government is doing will actually promote what we are trying to stop. However, on our side of the house, we will try to argue the fact that we are willing to accept all these negatives that are probably going to come about, that they speak about in their fourth point. We are willing to accept all these freedom of speech and all these stuff that we are going to break, because this is an exception. This is a person who has been sent out to fight a war without any decision being taken on his side. He did not say whether he will go or not. It's like it is not his choice. But
it's for everyone, not just soldiers. It's not drafted soldiers either. It's everyone's funerals in the world, in America.
You said freedom of return, respect to returning soldiers, right?
Yeah, there's a point of clarification where like a lot of the protests have actually been for military members, but it applies to everyone.
Zach asked this. You're part of it.
But I clarified my relation to Raj.
Yeah.
Okay, so what we are saying is that these on the military side, we like to defend on these on the point that the political decisions that you are trying to protest against, that these protesters try to protest against, have nothing to do with the people who've died themselves. And on this point, we like to differentiate this, because what they are protesting against has nothing to do with the people to whom the harm is actually being done. So we would like to say that if you have a problem with the political decision being taken, take it to the right places, take it before the courts, take it before Parliament, take it before Congress. However, coming to a funeral and causing all this mayhem, all these protests, and causing emotional trauma to family members. The disrespect to the soldier, disrespect to any member of society, we think is wrong. And we think that the freedom of speech and all the other freedoms that he's talked about under the First Amendment should not be able to protect you against these harms that you're causing to the rest of society, especially when a person has just passed away. So, for the second point that we bring up is that in case of, say, a soldier who followed his orders and came back, you, on your side of the house, would argue that you actually have the right to protest at his funeral. However, we would say that this soldier had no part to play in the action that he was carrying out. Therefore, he just followed his orders, which you, on your side of the house, advocating allowing these people to protest at his funeral, you probably did not draft him and go to fight a war for your country while that soldier did. And therefore, you cannot really equate him with the other citizens at whose funeral you might have other powers. So we say that this soldier died for his country without having any part to play in the decision of his going out and fighting a war, waging a war. And therefore we think he deserves respect to the extent that perhaps you would not be able to accommodate for other members of American society. And therefore we think that an exception should be made for him, where you should not be able to go and disrespect him after he has just given his life for the purpose of your country. The third point that we like to bring up is the emotional trauma to the family members that it causes. Now, these people who are gathered there, you must understand, apart from these hoodlums who are advocating create trouble in this place, everyone else there is there to pay the respects to these people who died. And they want to pay their respects in a manner that is convenient to them. Like in a manner where they think the person who they loved and knew all their life is not getting disrespected. And I think we owe it to them, like coming back after dying, essentially, we think that for just 60 minutes before his funeral and 60 minutes after is a length of time which we can afford to give to them to commemorate the dead. So we do not think that on the government side of the house they should have any problems giving that much time to honor the dead just to protect the freedom of speech and other things which we will speak about later on in the on-case points, which we do not think apply in this case. Now, on the on-case side, now they speak about the freedom of speech in the First Amendment. They say sometimes we even permit negative speeches and restricting less popular ideas would be bad. On our side of the house, we would say we are not restricting less popular ideas. You are free to go about and give negative speeches, give speeches against these people anywhere else. This is a place where they are essentially they have taken this place, this one spot in America, this one burial ground where they will now hold a funeral service to honor their dead. And we think that it is only fair that they be able to honor their dead in an atmosphere where you are not shouting abuses or anything that degrades them at the place of their funeral. We think there are lots of other spots in America where you will be able to practice your freedom of speech. So, for example, say we are studying in a school. We restrict the freedom of speech around that school. You cannot shout near a school. You cannot blow the horn of your car. So there are cases where we think there should be silence, and in those places, freedom of speech should not apply because there are extenuating factors where, say, noise is considered to be a problem. And we think that just like in a school, in a funeral also, noise is considered to be a problem because that has been a fundamental theory in our religion, in our society, since the start of time. Go ahead.
Yeah, you said that they can protest anywhere else they want and that they just should protest in those places. But these protesters specifically designed these places because that's where they feel the protest is most effective. Why are you denying their right to protest when they want?
Well, I might find that speaking right next to a school is very convenient for me. However, I have to respect the rights of other people as well. If, say for example, they are saying their protest will have the most effect over here. However, you must consider this. If the funeral was not to be held, they would not have had the place in the first place. They would not have been able to gain this media spectacle, as they say, if the funeral had not been held. And therefore, we think that the priority that the funeral gets over these protests is much more. So, for the second point that they bring up is attacks against minorities are allowed on the streets anyway, and the government should not be restrictive in this case. However, we think that the government does have a duty to be restrictive in this case and honor the dead because it was on these government directives that these soldiers were sent to the front to fight, and they should not have a problem against it. So, we also think that for any other citizen of America to whom this law also applies, apart from the soldiers, we think that the government should be restrictive because the policy of honoring the dead is a policy that has been cherished in our society forever. It is exactly like the policy that the case that I threw up at the school, because we believe that school children should have the ability to study in silence, and we should do everything possible to make that arrangement possible. And so we think that at a funeral also, people should be able to remember the dead in silence, because we recognize that to honor someone, to remember the fond memories you have of them, is best done when there is silence and people are not shouting abuses or wrong things against that person. I think we think that it interferes with the process of honoring someone. So they also said that funerals should not be exempt just because they're emotional and emotional cases. We think that is just so. Because they're so emotional, therefore they should be exempt, because funerals are emotional, and we think that by allowing you to carry out these protests at the funerals, we are actually allowing a clash of societies over here. We are allowing people who might we are essentially splitting our society in two. We are allowing these people to create such trouble in areas where funerals are being carried out. Essentially, the people who are there for the funeral will be angry at you, and we do not want the situation where our citizens start to hate each other, and we will try to cut down on such practices, because you are essentially, they did not go against to your place and try to create a problem. So we are essentially advocating that you do not come when they have booked a place and they have booked a time, and we do not want you to interfere in their private practices. So, for the fourth point that you brought up was that protests become a media spectacle and you should not encourage them, and that you will find other means. We are willing to make the sacrifice on our side of the house, because we mean to honor the dead. And therefore, if we will try to not make it a media spectacle, if you wish to do so, the First Amendment will protect you. We understand that, and we are willing to make that sacrifice. We know that it will encourage you. You might go somewhere else and do it. You might try other methods. And if we find that it interferes with the system that we have, if it interferes with the rights of individuals, we will try to cut down on it, because that is the government's job. We will try to provide the respect, to honor the commitments of people, to honor the wishes of people. So that is our job. Our job is not to see about what will possibly encourage you in the future. Our job is to take the right decision now, and therefore we think your fourth point is invalid. So for all those reasons, we are proud to oppose.
And I'll call upon the member of government to deliver the next constructive speech for around not to exceed 8 minutes.
Sure. Short.
Yeah. Don't worry about it. Raj went behind, so don't worry. All right. So, thank you very much for what's been an interesting route so far. Raj, I know you want to talk about soldiers. I'm going to talk about some other people throughout my thing too, so don't get offended. So let's start a write-up case for a little bit. So the first point that they talk about is why there are other means to protesting, right? Well, you can go through courts. Well, you can go, I guess, to England and go through parliaments. That all of a sudden Raj wants to bring up. But the point is that we should not deny people the right to protest in the manner in which they want to, right? Because the point about the First Amendment is that you're protecting people's rights to do things that are specifically seen by society as not that pretty. Whether you're talking bad back, in the Puritanical era about Christianity, whether you're talking like anti-slavery, if you're an abolitionist. The point is that throughout history, a lot of speech that has been seen as controversial has been tried to be quelled, has been tried to be put down. And on our side of the house, we're saying, yeah, this clearly, one second, Raj, this clearly falls under that statute, right? People are telling soldiers that, no one is like put up in society more than soldiers, that they're going to hell, that their souls are damned, and that they're evil, evil people by an evil government. There's nothing worse than that. The point being on our side of the house, we protect any form of speech. The government should not discriminate on that speech unless it sees specific societal harms, which we haven't seen. Sure.
But if some manner of speech or some manner of protest is illegal, wouldn't you say that it should not be carried out? That if it goes against society, wouldn't you try to clamp down on it?
Okay, so there are two things there. One, you say because it's illegal, you should clamp down on it. Our argument is that this is a bad law. So even if it is illegal, we're saying it shouldn't be illegal to do this. So your second point is that there are societal harms. I think by your overview basically concedes to our fourth point that the societal harms are actually much worse on your side of the house, because we think that you create more of a media spectacle. You're doing much worse things. You're actually extrapolating the situation more than it need be. Moreover, the harms don't have to be as tangible, right? Like, if I can literally scream to the point in which Dan's head explodes, that could be seen as violating the harms principle. But what we would say on our side of the house is when speech is just meant to insult somebody, we protect that on our side. Moreover, we think in any clash of the harms principle, we should defer to rights that are specifically enumerated in the Constitution, right to protest, right to free speech. We shouldn't go make up rights like there's a right to a protestless funeral, right? We don't think that that actually exists. So the second thing that they say on their side of the house is that these soldiers had no actions. One, I would just say these aren't just soldiers, right? That like they're everybody. This is for everyone. It's just called that because like politicians really like passing laws that have soldiers naming them, calling them fallen heroes, and getting more votes, right, from soldiers. Moreover, why soldiers, right? Just because Raj says, well, they went off and died for their country. Well, why would soldiers deserve any more rights than anybody else? Like, do Jews who suffered through the Holocaust not deserve the right not to be called whatever slurs they would be by neo-Nazis? No, but we let people call people names. It's the reason we let the Ku Klux Klan exist in American society. It's the reason we let people say hurtful things and they can call me like some stupid ugly kid. Yeah, right.
But wouldn't you differentiate with the case when you call a person an insult right to his face, but in this case, the person is dead and he cannot reply back to you and you're still calling
No,
him?
I mean, look, how about this, right? Like, I'm going to say something. Hitler sucks, right? Like Hitler's dead. You can't say anything about it, but I can still say whatever the hell I want about him. I can say it about anyone I want. Jerry Falwell, douchebag. There you go. You shouldn't lock me up just because I have controversial ideas about people who have passed away. That's the point. Specifically in this matter, when I'm trying to, like, not just me saying like curse words or anything, when I'm actually trying to protest because it's my right to protest, you shouldn't stop that, right? Moreover, I would say under this point that we think it's actually specifically like dangerous to silence dissenters against like any form of government. It seems like what Raj is basically trying to say is like these people are died for us. Like, well, actually, the people like in charge, especially the military power, we should be able to like dissent and talk badly and criticize them as much as possible. Trying to like quell that as much is actually very, very totalitarian in its nature. Like these are the people that we should allow. I think what Dan brings up on cases that hurtful speech specifically and speech that is controversial should be like protected more than any other speech, especially when we think that it could lead to like totalitarian things. Last one, they talk about loved ones, how we owe it to these people. We think that, why do we owe it to these people? Like, we think we owe it to the American citizens to uphold free speech, to uphold the freedom of protest. This is what we're talking about, how we allow hurtful speech all the time, right? Those are the people we owe it to. Raj never gives any warrants as to why we owe it to these people. Moreover, we have the third point on case, where it's that we don't actually owe it to these people. This is not a right enumerated anywhere. We never say that you can't, like, have protests against you, right? As long as people aren't stepping into your house, into your property, and breaking some other right, which we think under the harm principle would be weighed against, right? As long as they're not violating that, they can do whatever they want. They can go, they can protest, as long as it's in a legal nature. We're just saying that this law, making it illegal, is unjust. Back on case. So the first thing that we talk about is how this violates the First Amendment, specifically the freedom of speech and the freedom of protest. And Raj says, do it somewhere else, just like, go out on the streets, like, go protest somewhere else. It's like if you have a war protest, right, and you want to, like, protest outside the Capitol building. They're like, no, go do it back at your houses, but anywhere outside the government. Why? Why can't these people do it here? These people are passionate Christians who think that these people go to hell and they have to tell the American people and warn them of their eternal damnation. Guess what? They might be lunatics, but we allow lunatics to say lunatical things, right? We allow people to say really fucked up shit in America. That's the bottom line, right? So if they want it here, great. As long as they're within the framework, as long as they're not hurting anybody violently, and as long as they're saying, they say whatever they want. As long as they're saying things, we should allow them to do it. The second point they talk about is how they restrict school speech all the time. I didn't know that we specifically did this. But moreover, I think that they need to justify more of this other than saying, like, yeah, we do it already. Like, well, we could say that, like, maybe it's bad on this side of the house. We don't know all the points about it, but we don't think that you should be doing these. And we also think that we need to outweigh things, right? Maybe there are actual harms in terms of schools. I don't know the specifics. But we would say into our fourth point, if these harms aren't being outweighed on their side of the house, if they're actually much worse, then we shouldn't defer to them. The second thing we talk about is how we allow hurtful speech all the time. We talked about this, and they basically say that their main crux point under this is that honoring the dead is something that should be cherished. Like, look, yeah, I've lost loved ones. We've all lost loved ones. It sucks. If someone said something to me about, like, my loved one dying, I would probably want to punch them in their face. But the thing being is that this is an emotional response. And what Dan specifically tells you on case is that we don't make exceptions for emotional responses like that, right? Like, sure, we really think it's messed up for neo-Nazis to protest in Jewish neighborhoods with Holocaust survivors. We seriously think that it's messed up for the Klan to go ahead and do these. But these are all subjective statements about free speech, right? We are literally, as the government, saying this speech is bad or good. We would say under any free democracy, under any free republic, we should not have the government dictating what is good speech and what is bad speech. We as a society may think, yeah, this is like messed up, but the government shouldn't be regulating that because of all the dangers that come to it, aside from the fact that it's unconstitutional. The third thing that we talk about, no thanks, Raj, I'm about to basically protect time. The third thing that we talk about is how there's no right to a protestless funeral, and they say, oh, well, we can cut down they say, don't interfere in their private practices. This isn't a private practice. We said, you can't go into their homes. You can't go kick their dog and be like, you're going to hell. But if they're at a funeral, you can stand outside the gates or any place in the public sphere, right, that's not infringing on their private property and do this. The problem with this is that the government is manufacturing places that you can't be. You can't be 300 feet within, and they're limiting the time. They're basically saying once it ends, an hour before it ends, an hour before it begins, you can't do it. But that's specifically when these people would want to protest, right? It would be like any time. It would be like saying to abortion, people want to protest abortion places, right? Well, you have to do an hour before it closes or an hour before it opens. It's like, no, this is when these people want to protest. Let them do what they want. The fourth and final point is while the law is ineffective and can't work, they really botch this. Besides conceding it in the overview, Raj then says on case, we mean to honor the dead. Like, fine, it doesn't matter what you mean to do. The point is that we have to look at the actual tangible weighing of harms, and they really miss this up because you're going to create more media spectacles. This is exactly what the Westboro Baptist Church wants, and radical groups that do this wants. They want cameras coming over here. They want people protesting back at them. The best thing to do, which Dan says that doesn't go refuted, is inaction. Go ahead and tell these people, look, do whatever you want. You're a bunch of losers. We don't really care about you, and no one's going to care about what you're doing. You might shed some tears, but it's really all for naught. We don't really care what you're doing. So the last thing where we say they'll go to other outlets. If you actually do this, they can go ahead and go to your homes and maybe go outside or just do more radical things. The only thing Raj says is this is we can make laws elsewhere. So what are you going to do? Infringe on these people's right to free speech and protest to the point where they can never get their message across? No. Let these people do what they want for all the reasons we are proud to propose.
Here. Thank the member of government for his remarks, and I call upon the member of the opposition to close out the construction portion of the round in a very radical speech. Not to exceed. Here.
We'll see what I can do about the radical part. Okay, so thank you, Mr. Speaker, for coming out here, or not really actually going anywhere, for being here to judge the round today. And I'd like to thank Raj for giving an excellent opening hello, if kind of specific to soldiers. And I'd also like to thank SideGov for bringing such an interesting case to the table, kind of an interesting one to run. So I'm going to go straight onto the off case. First of all, Raj talks about this idea of being a soldier and being respected as a soldier, and how this should be an exception to the idea that you can protest anywhere you want. And first of all, I want to talk about the idea that, as Pat said, there are more than just soldiers that apply to this law. There are other people. But let's look at, the actual things that are going to happen in real life. How many times you can have protests that are, outside of, in the modern day and age that are outside the soldier? How many funerals are really going to be protested about? Are the majority of these cases, the ones that we are going to apply most often, are going to be soldiers? So Raj's analysis in this part doesn't drop. This is something that still directly applies to this case and should be taken under consideration. To this idea that this shouldn't be an exception, Pat has talked about there's other ways, as Raj said, there's other ways to go through besides protests. But as Pat tried to say, a lot of controversial speech has been necessary in the past, and it's not something that we should censor just because it's controversial. It's something that could develop and could lead to something good. It's something that we accept as an American people. But I'm going to say that it's not the idea of the speech and the fact that it's a radical idea, because it's not such a radical idea to have someone protest a war or someone to protest someone going to war. What we're showing on our side of the house, and one of the major cruxes of our argument, is this idea of honoring the people who have died and really respecting people who are opening themselves up to this pain, okay? A funeral is a time when someone comes forward and opens themselves up emotionally in order to participate in an event where they can really let their emotions go and let them flow and let it be out, open, near, not protected, and just show how they felt about this person, this loved person, someone very important to their life. And we ought to respect the fact that this is a really emotionally vulnerable time for these people. And this is a time where the harm to their psyche and the harm to their emotions can be great and can be greater than physical pain if you're insulting someone that they have respected so much in their life and someone whom they have honored. So this idea that we should respect that this controversial speech come through. Well, first of all, as we've said, it's going to be it's going to be something that is disrespectful to these people, and these people are emotionally vulnerable, and we ought to be able to put on the line their values and respect them. Why should we respect the protesters any more than we respect the people participating in the funeral? This is a time where they come forward for a specific event in their own lives to really honor this person who has died. Okay, so we're moving on to the second point, which is Raj talked about people being protested against despite the fact that they were only following orders. And, to this Pat says, not just soldiers. And as I've said, it isn't just soldiers, and I'll agree with this, but the majority of cases that you have are going to be soldiers in the modern day and age. You're not going to find that many other funerals who are outside this kind of box. This idea that it's not just soldiers, doesn't hold. And he also said, why just soldiers? What about, Jews, who are afraid of being insulted? And what about, other people, who have quote-unquote earned the right not to be insulted, etc., etc. Well, there's this idea that this is a time, we're not saying you can't insult these people. We're not saying, you can never do this. We've laid down a time space where you cannot do this, because this is a time for them to be respected, and it's a time not only for them, but for their loved ones. So you're not really disrespecting the soldiers so much as you're coming in and ruining the emotional quality of the funeral for the people who who loved this person and who were part of their life. So you're, the harms to these, outside individuals, these third parties, isn't justified by the message that these people are trying to make when they come in and protest against these funerals. So if they really want to protest against these funerals, they have other means to do it, as has been on both sides of the house, okay? So there are other ways that you can do this without harming a third party like they are doing in this case, okay? So it's not just the soldiers you're insulting. And the third point, actually, I will take a question now.
Yeah, so Dan's bar mitzvah was probably an awesome experience. I wish I was there. So if there were neo-Nazis protesting outside in a legal manner, should we have banned it because it was an emotional thing for Dan's family members and loved one in Dan, and they were ruining the moment?
Well, just to clarify, I'm pretty sure a bar mitzvah is a private event of some
Legally
sort.
protested, though.
But, you can legally protest it.
Yeah.
Wait, but then, no, this isn't a... Yes, okay, if you want to take, the logical extension of this, then yes. Because these people are coming in to directly, insult Dan and his family and directly, demean them in ways that they don't deserve, that they have not earned, and that has, no real rational bearing, okay? So, huh? The rights of the minority. Thank you. Thank you for that point, Pat. Okay? So if you want to argue that, then yes, I will concede that you can then have neo-Nazis protesting at his bar mitzvah if he killed Jesus. Okay? So I'm running out of time, or I'm starting to approach out of time. So I'm going to move on to the third point, which is oh wait, no, I already did the third point, which is the paying of respect. I'm kind of covering that now. As it's kind of been past analysis, that these are third parties that are respecting the dead, and you're really going against them more than you're going against this soldier or person who has died. So then I'm going to go on case in order to try to cover some of the points that Dan made in his opening speech. So first, you're going against, he says you're going against the First Amendment and violating free speech, and you have to protect rights. Well, as I learned over the course of the Brown tournament, there's a collateral bar rule where they determine, what is constitutional and what isn't. So there's already ways we can go around, quote-unquote, these rights and, quote-unquote, violate these rights. It's part of the American system that nothing is an absolute and all things can be, bent, and rules can be bent in some ways. The idea of checks and balances. So, the idea that we're, violating the rights of these people is just, it's bullshit, quite frankly. So, second point, he said it allows, we have to, 1 second. Oh yeah, no, okay, we allow normally time-space restrictions against the message, but for these people, in order to get their message across, this is the important venue and the important time that they need to do it. And to this I reply, if they really have a message that can come across by insulting this one soldier, this one specific person in this one specific instance, then it's not a message they need to be making to the entire society of America. This is way too specific for an entire societal thing. If you really have a message that is a general idea and something that you're trying to make in order to change a society or to try to manipulate things your way, then you're not going to get this in this specific instance with this one soldier that you couldn't get outside in other venues and other protest locations and times. So again, this idea doesn't make any sense. The third thing he says is we have the right to the protest, and you can't stop protest because of emotion inequalities. And as we've said, this is really kind of just an assertion that both sides disagree upon, because there are times in the American legal system that where emotions are taken into account. There are crimes of passion where juries take different ideas into account of why you did this. So this idea that we completely ignore emotional qualities in the American government is again a bullshit idea. So I'm not going to go through and try to convince Mr. Speaker that our assertion is more efficient than their assertion. But it really just comes down to one side could be right, the other side could be right. So this point doesn't really have any bearing on the round. So the fourth point that he makes is you're going to have, they said this was one of their most important points, that you're going to have people who do things more radically or are going to be louder and generally more disruptive in the protest when you like try to restrict it. And the truth is, anytime you restrict anything, you're going to have people be louder and more violent about it. But your problem is, as you've said, like people are looking for a way to get their message out, and if we restrict them and then they get their message out more easily, does that make sense that we should not restrict them then? One of your points was you're restricting their ability to get their message across, and then your another point was they're going to be able to get their message across more easily, and that doesn't make any sense. Like these two very conflicting ideas, mutually exclusive ideas. So you're always going to have this, but on our side of the house, we believe that respecting the dead, which is a tradition that like goes back way farther than like even the idea of America. This idea of respecting people who have, especially soldiers who have gone through and fought for their country to protect other people and who have earned a form of respect, which one might not be like quantitative, does exist and is like something that we take into account in our society, means that it's going to like overrule these people's abilities to protest and insult their family members and insult the honor of these dead people. And so it's for all of these reasons, this idea that there are already ways to get around the First Amendment. There are better ways that they can get this message across, and they are going to be able to get this message across in either case, in either side of the house. And also the fact that we as Americans place like respect in high esteem and also place honor in high esteem, that we say our side of the house is superior, and Mr. Speaker should vote for our side of the house. Thank you. Okay.
Why?
No, I have to leave. You can't take my timer.
Okay.
You can take this.
Okay.
Might go.
Oh, how did I do? What would I get for speaks?
25. He'll email you. No.
Okay. Yeah, I would say probably 25.
Yeah.
25.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we can talk more about it.
Yeah. Thursday. Have fun.
Alright. Call upon the honorable leader of the opposition to do his thing. You're here.
Okay, so Mr. Speaker, the round comes down to this. Like, can we actually draft a law like this? And do we have sufficient grounds for doing so? So, I'll first address, can we actually do this? Now, they speak of the freedom of speech. They speak of ad hominem. They speak that funerals should not be an exception. On our side of the house, we would like to address all 3 points in a simple case. Consider this, we spoke of schools. Now, when American law was first established, they said that you cannot change the First Amendment. You cannot violate the rights of free speech and so on and so forth. But we spoke of a school. When schools were first established in America, did we have these do not blow horns outside the schools at that time? I don't think so. But after cars came in, after vehicles, automobiles came in, after people really started making a hell of a noise outside the school, after these cities came up, we made the laws to apply them to these new situations. And so we think that when these lunatics nowadays, in this new situation, when they come into these funerals and start making noises, they start disturbing the peace over there. I think the government is fully justified to bring in new laws to quell a new problem. And we think that that is the job of the government. That is why we do not follow a set rule of laws. We have amendments. We have new laws. So we think that on their side of the house, they are trying to negate all the effects that the government can have on laws in bringing in new laws. And we think that we are fully justified in bringing in a new law to deal with the new situation. Now, why do we want to restrict them? So, we essentially think that my partner Zach put up the example of prior restriction and injunction. Like, we actually think that it is the duty of our society to prevent violence in situations where we think that it might spread so. And they brought up the fact that funerals are emotional places. There are people who are on the deceased side of the family. They respect the deceased. They are there to honor the dead. And we feel that a bunch of lunatics coming in here and saying bad things about that person will probably provoke a conflict. There are chances that there might be trouble over there. And we think there is a duty of the government to prevent such acts being committed which go against, say, the respect of another party. For example, we do not allow neo-Nazis to hold parades in, say, a Jewish place, because we try to then place a prior injunction, a prior restriction or a restriction on that place. because we think there's a duty of the government, and that is why we have these laws, because we try to prevent things from happening which could go out of control. And we think that this is a classic example of such a place in which violence could go out of control, because you essentially have these people who are trying to be disrespectful deliberately to a group of people who are there for the sole purpose of paying the respects. So we think we think that the government does have the right to frame these laws to take care of a situation which the government and the rest of society does not approve of, and we think it is fully justified in that case. Now, consider these points. They drop the fact that the soldiers who have been killed do not deserve respect. Pat somehow put across this point that they're not all soldiers, they're most civilians and all that. But my partner Zach brought up the point that most of these people are going to be soldiers anyway, and they do deserve respect because they did not commit a crime for which you are punishing them. And we think the rest of society, if they think that this is wrong, essentially we have the power to stop these people from committing a crime, and that we do not think that giving an advantage to these people in the way that holding this funeral gives them the chance to create this media spectacle. We should not allow them to abuse this, because we think that holding the funeral is the first action, and they should not be able to take advantage of it to promote their own rights, which go directly contradictory to the person who has died, and therefore go contradictory to the people who are holding this funeral in the first place. So, essentially, for all these reasons, we would like to oppose. Thank you.
Thank the Leader of the Opposition and recall the Prime Minister to close out the round with a speech not to exceed 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Steve, for calling me up, and thank you guys for a fantastic talk. So I'd just like to start off the top by addressing some of the straw man arguments that cropped up in the LOR. So the first thing is, like, they give us this analysis for, like, why it's okay to have new laws. So we're not arguing that we can't have new laws. We're not arguing that there's any barriers, like, progressing society through legislation. That's not our advocacy on our side of the house. We can have new laws too. The question, though, is what is the substance of these laws? Is this law a good law or a bad law? And that is essentially the subject of the debate today. The second straw man that sort of crystallized out of LOR, this idea of violence. I think it's, again, not our advocacy on our side of the house. We do not permit violent protests on our side of the house. That is still not okay. The government still reserves the right to regulate the manner of protests. Time, place, manner. That's still okay. Government can legitimately do that. That's not what we're advocating on our side of the house. Completely gone from the round. So that being said, we have 2 points of crystallization I would like to talk about. The main ideas that cropped up in this round. So the first thing is this idea of a right to a funeral. So all of their analysis hinges on this rights-weighing comparison, where we have this right to freedom of speech, which on their side of the house is outweighed by this alleged right to a funeral. I'm going to give you some examples why their analysis for this falls, and also explain to you why our third independent point, insofar as Pat did away with all the responses to this, still stands and outweighs all this analysis. So an example that we get from them is this idea of like, you go to a school and you can't protest like outside the school, right? Well, here's the thing. If we have like a right to education, this is something that Pat and I agree, and probably both of this debate will agree that a right to education is a pretty established right that we enjoy in society. So the question then is that having loud protesters outside the school meaningfully infringes the right of the people in the school to access that education. So the question then is there a right to a funeral in this case? So the problem is that they assert on faith that there is this right to a funeral without giving us any framework for understanding how we understand what these rights are, how we derive these rights, or how we weigh these rights independent of each other. The only standard that they give us that's remotely similar to anything like this is this idea of emotion. And emotion is a terrible standard for establishing what rights are, because then essentially the argument becomes circular. That the reason why we have rights is to protect minority expressions. But the problem is, if we defer to majority will about what is emotionally acceptable, then the right becomes definitionally incoherent. Because we have this idea that we have this right to a funeral because people like having funerals. But then the right is meaningless because the whole point of having the rights is to protect the minority expression, which is completely irrelevant by the fact that we define rights in terms of what the majority wants. That's not okay. But another point that they give is that tradition is that they have this tradition response. They're but we've been doing this for millennia, man. This outdates America even. Well, this is also a terrible standard because just because things have existed in the past doesn't mean that we necessarily have to respect them in the present. Just because we respected slaveholders in the past doesn't mean we need to respect them in the present. Or just because one religion predates another doesn't mean we have to give special protection to the religion that predates another. We think that there are a lot of really weird outcomes that come if we try to apply tradition in this way. So all of the warrants for this kind of right to a funeral falls in these cases. So what we get from that is, to fill that void from all that analysis that just fell, is our third independent point, which still stands, which is that there is no right to a funeral. That we don't have to create these rights just based on what people want. That's not how rights work. And Pat gives us this analysis for, listen, there are unenumerated rights. We do have the Ninth Amendment. But insofar as it's unclear in this case, we have a clearly enumerated right to free speech. We have a clearly enumerated right to protest. We have to weigh those clearly enumerated rights against this specious foundation for a right to a funeral. Not only a right to a funeral, but a right to a funeral under specific circumstances, under specific conditions, even though those conditions directly violate some of the other protections that we specifically enumerate in the Constitution. But more under this, the idea of the right to funeral, is when they talk about the soldiers, and they're like, oh, but it's going to apply to soldiers in most cases anyway, right? But there's an implicit concession at this point, where they say that soldiers deserve this, but not necessarily other people in society do deserve this. Well, first of all, this isn't the bill that we're talking about. This bill applies to everyone, so this analysis is really false. The fact of the matter is, it can be applied to everyone. That's why it's in fact problematic. But look at what they're actually saying here. That we don't necessarily have to afford protections for some people in society. We say, yeah, that's fine. Or even if they've been able to draw a meaningful distinction between soldiers and not soldiers in terms of a right to a funeral, they still are arguing on their side of the house that there is no right to a funeral in some of these cases, which means that all of our analysis fills that void, which means that we are clearly winning on this point. So the last thing I'd like to close on is this idea of the time, place, manner restrictions. Because what we tell you is that there are some times when we can regulate these kinds of things. But the problem in this case is that the content of the protest, the regulation is supposed to be content neutral, but the content in this case is dependent on the time. It's dependent on the location. And in this sense, regulating time, place, and matter actually impinges the content neutrality of the regulation. So, Zach makes a really damning concession in this speech. So let's extend the principle that we're going to apply this emotional standard to everything. This is really terrible because we can apply this to cases that are emotionally objectionable, like the KKK, like Jews at bar mitzvahs. I did have a fantastic bar mitzvah. Thank you. But what about, for example, war protests? That just because the families of soldiers might be insulted by someone protesting a war doesn't mean that the war protest is invalid. We still think that it's okay to protest wars, and that's an important form of civic expression because it's a check. It's the popular will coming out against something the legislature has done. This is an important part of democratic responsiveness, an important part of democratic society. And just because families of soldiers might be offended, they might be emotionally harmed, doesn't mean that we have to ban this expression of speech just because people are offended. So, to protect all of those instances, we propose.
Shake hands. Well done.
I don't think I made the
Stop the recording.
I meant before.